It was landing day. Shy rays of sunlight were just beginning to break through the morning haze, coloring the sky above Carysta a somber shade of purple. Hundreds of peons were lined up in rows in the center of a large square that resembled a medieval city market. Empty stalls and trays for the coming trade gaped everywhere. Alex found himself in the first row, tightly pressed on both sides by Victor's and Sam's bodies. Fear was transmitted from one to the other through the visceral atmosphere of anxious anticipation. No one knew what was coming, but they sensed it, something terrible. Braxis and his pack of overseers patrolled the square continuously, licking the tips of their plasma wands lovingly. And suddenly he saw her, the woman who had thrown him the gun during the chaos of the landing. She stood alone, in the farthest row, defiantly straight and with a dazzling smile on her lips. Their gazes crossed for a moment, and she winked faintly at him with one eye. Then her lips moved, as if silently saying something. Alex's musings were interrupted by a sudden rumble that shook the square. In this new vibration lurked something primal, something inhuman, the vibration of dominance emitted by top predators in the presence of their victims. Waves of terror swept through the ranks of the peons as the Hajis began to emerge from the main gate. The elite Haji caste, the top of the pyramid of dominance over Carysta, exuded a wild emanation of power and lust for violence. They marched in uninhibitedly, their chins jutting and their powerful shoulders squared. The first to emerge was Draken himself, the legend, the pinnacle of the Haji hierarchy, the right hand of the 13th privileged himself. Dressed in a bizarre mixture of futuristic armor and ancient warrior regalia, he looked like the embodiment of bloodthirsty power from the depths of time. On his head he wore a magnificent helmet of buffalo horns, and in one hand he clutched a long, double-edged sword. Draken was followed by his numerous retinue, a phalanx of Haji, equally wildly dressed and studded with gold jewelry. They swung axes, spears, and massive clubs, growling impatiently and glaring at the crouching peons. Like hunting dogs anticipating a quick bite. "Greetings, you useless scum!" Draken shouted in a ringing voice and, raising his sword, made a broad gesture to the men. "You are the Haji Guard, the chosen warriors of the great evil. In honor of the initiation of new recruits into the Carysta philosophy, today we will teach you a brief lesson in humility." Alex vividly imagined someone humbly prostrate on the ground under the fierce blows of the clubs. His stomach twisted in a nauseating spasm. Noticing his pale complexion, Victor whispered, "Don't lose heart, boy. If we survive, we'll have a chance for a new status or even a job." "A job?" Alex involuntarily blurted out. At that moment there was a shriek in the square as one of the Haji jumped to the nearest prisoner and slashed him across the chest with his axe. The man sank to the ground, bleeding from the gruesome wound. "Shorty's right, you bio-murderer." Draken roared so loudly that Alex's ears ached. "If any of you lowlifes live to see tomorrow, you'll have a job and a few crumbs of privilege. But first you must pass this little test." His Haji companions picked up the roar, waving their weapons and shouting in different voices. Braxis and the guard stepped aside, clearly anticipating the coming massacre. Alex was numb with hopeless horror, hearing the hoarse sighs and whistles from the peon ranks. People were beginning to slowly suffocate. At that moment, the woman he had met earlier caught his eye again. Her lips moved clearly, silently saying, "Back to back." She looked around at the people around her and nodded to her left and right, indicating to the nearest peons. Before Alex could even realize it, there was a sudden deafening rumble of gunfire. A spume of fire erupted from the ranks of the peons, and the body of one of the Haji was engulfed in flames. He let out an inhuman shriek, rolling on the ground as the men clubbed him to death. Everything around him instantly turned to chaos. Alex felt someone's hand roughly push him aside, forcing him back to back with Victor and Sam on either side. They automatically curled into a tight ball, pressing themselves into each other. A few more peons joined them on the other sides, forming a sort of shapeless phalanx of tightly woven human bodies. And in the same second, an avalanche of furious Haji descended upon them. With wheezes and mats they began to chop the tangle with merciless blows of clubs and swords. One of their phalanx let out a shrill cry as a sudden flash of pain pierced his body, but the others clenched tighter. The Haji, entangled in this dense mass of arms and legs, began to scramble in their own frenzy, interfering with each other and getting mixed up in their own blows. One of them suddenly shrieked in surprise, and Alex saw that a peon had grabbed a splintered board and kicked his assailant between his legs with all his might. Taking advantage of the confusion, their solid phalanx shifted, shortening the distance to the nearest counters. Someone, shielding his head with his hands, landed on the wooden countertop, but was immediately knocked off it by someone's crushing slap. Alex instinctively ducked lower, escaping the hail of cobblestones and debris that the Haji suddenly began to shower them with. In the deadly mess of thumping bodies and voices, someone suddenly shoved a weighty piece of rebar into Alex's hands. He grasped it, seized by primal instincts, and with a fierce roar swung it at one of the Hajis who had brought his club down upon him. Crack! The blow struck him squarely on the temple, and the big Haji fell dead. Suddenly there was a monstrous medieval roar as Draken rushed into the thick of the fray in all his warlike fury. His huge sword flashed through the air, slashing left and right, cutting through the bodies of the peons and sprinkling the neighborhood with fountains of blood. It seemed that the massacre lasted forever. Alex only senselessly struck with a rebar bar, pushed away fists and clubs, and tried to keep his place in the tangle of bodies. There were inhuman screams, the slurping of torn flesh and the splashing of more and more bloody streams. And then it was over as suddenly as it had begun. Draken stepped back, swinging his sword in a brown stain. A ringing silence spread across the square, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the wheezing of the dying. After looking at the blood-soaked stones, Draken broke into a rumbling laughter akin to a lion's roar and suddenly raised his hand and gave a thumbs-up okay, as if to say, "Well done, brave men. You have passed the first round." Then he turned to the weary handful of surviving peons who had managed to form a human shield. "You can make real fighters, you scum. Then you have been honored. How about a job in my guild, huh? Believe me, with your good fortune today, you'll definitely raise your status, even if I don't see you as assassins." The reward for not letting themselves be slashed with impunity in this bloodbath was a job. Alex stared incomprehensibly at the bloody piece of rebar in his hands, realizing the enormity of this place.